Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday the 20th of April 2022, and in this programme tonight we'll be discussing the 80th anniversary that the small Mediterranean island known as Malta received the George Cross for its bravery and its courage for defying the Nazis. Now, Malta is a small Mediterranean island that's only 90 miles off the coast of Sicily, but during World War II played a major role, as we see on this map, of actually preventing the supply lines going from Italy to the colony of Libya that was held by Italy to help with the North African campaign. And literally, this story is a forgotten story of history, but it's also one in which we see God's sovereignty. If Malta was captured by the Italians and by the Nazis and by the Axis powers, this could have changed the whole course of the war. Reagan, I love these historical programs, primarily because when we look at them, we study them, we see the hand of God in these events that occurred over 80 years ago. And who would have thought that this small little island off the coast of Sicily would be so strategic during the Second World War, with its population of around 250,000 people, would actually have a massive say on the final outcome of the Second World War and played a crucial role. Also thanks to its governor, who was a born-again believer, who was posted to this position. Yeah, it really is incredible. I mean, we're having this program as it is the 80th anniversary of Malta being awarded the St. George's Cross because they defied the Nazis, and they consistently persevered in their persistent resistance against Nazi Germany. If you look at Malta today, maybe some viewers, maybe you've been to Malta, maybe you've seen it. From the pictures I've seen, it's a beautiful place, not been yet, but you would be forgiven for thinking, oh, this place seems relatively unspoiled, and it seems like a nice, beautiful, picturesque place. I mean, you can't really imagine, it's very hard to look at something like that and imagine it as war-ravaged. But here's a little-known fact. I mean, this whole story in one way may be very little known. Malta itself was bombed 3 times the intensity of the Blitz. I mean, picture that. Just if you look at the population density and you look at the size of the island itself, you crunch the numbers, 3 times the impact of the Blitz during the Second World War. And it was bombed more than any other country during the Second World War. Thousands of bombs dropped on Malta, not just the bombing of Malta, but there was also the blockade of goods, which meant that many people essentially starved. There was a quote in This is a book that Simon has given me for this evening's show. Yes, he's only just started reading it now. Yeah, he gave it to me just a few minutes ago, and I've learned all about this subject. So here's a quote by an American RAF pilot, Leo Nomis. I have never been to a place before or since that had such a visible atmosphere of doom, violence, and toughness about it. And indeed, despite the doom and the violence, despite the starvation that many were facing and the bombing that persisted, there was only for a very lengthy span of time, one 24-hour period where there weren't bombs dropping. 7,000 were killed of the Maltese. Many others had to resort to hiding in caves to protect themselves. It was that toughness that defied the Nazis and gave such an impact in the Second World War. And it was what its main strategic importance, Malta was that it stopped the supply lines. So the Axis powers wanted Malta because this would help with their North African campaign. Now, on a bigger picture, you could actually argue that if it wasn't for Malta, and Malta being in hands of the British and not being conquered by the Germans, effectively meant that they were able to defeat General Rommel
in the North Africa campaign. And if he hadn't been defeated, then Hitler's forces would have gone right the way through North Africa, would have invaded Egypt, where the British were based in Alexandria. And from there, the SS were to be deployed to the British Mandate of Palestine to root out its Jewish population. So spiritually and politically, Malta was unbelievably significant and actually changed the course of the war. But if we have a kind of historical overview of Malta to put it in context, so the Maltese islands went through a golden Neolithic period, the remains of which include the temples dedicated to the goddess of fertility. Later on, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and the Romans and the Byzantines all left their traces on the island. And of course, in 60 AD, St. Paul was shipwrecked on the island while on his way to Rome and brought Christianity to Malta. You can read that in the book of Acts. We also see that the Arabs conquered the island in 870 AD and left an important mark on the language of the Maltese. Until 1530, Malta was an extension of Sicily. It was Charles V who bequeathed Malta to the Sovereign Military Order of St. John's of Jerusalem, who ruled Malta from 1530 to 1798, following the Great Siege of 1565 with the Ottomans. The Knights took Malta through a new golden age, making it a key player in the cultural scene of the 17th and 18th century in Europe. And in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte took Malta from the Knights on his way to Egypt. The French presence on the island was short-lived, as the English were requested by the Maltese to help them against the French, and they blockaded the islands until 1800. British rule in Malta lasted until 1964, when Malta became an independent and Maltese adopted the British system of public administration, education and legislation. And then modern Malta began as a republic in 1974. The foreign military bases on the island were permanently closed in 1979. Malta joined the EU in May of 2004 and has been part of the Eurozone since January 2008. So that's a quick historical overview of the history of Malta.
In the Second World War, we see Malta's significance. You would be forgiven for thinking, well, Malta, how significant could it be? It is, as an island, only about the same size as the Isle of Wight. As we already saw on the map, it's situated there between Sicily and Tunisia. It's astride the sea lanes between the Western and Central Mediterranean Sea. But it has, as a result of its placement right there in the middle, essentially been extremely strategic. It's been well desired. That list of changing of hands that you just went through, Simon, shows how valued Malta was as a place, and doubtless the most significant part of its culture, even today, and its symbolism and stuff, would go back to the Order of St. John that had the greatest control of that place. But in World War II, 1939, the war begins. Malta is currently a British possession when the war kicks off. It's an important military post that links Gibraltar in the west to Egypt and the Suez Canal in the east. It also could serve as a stepping stone on an optimistic side, or as a barrier between Sicily and the Italian colony of Libya in North Africa. So remember, I was talking before the program with Simon, I sometimes feel like Italy gets let off a little bit when it comes to remembering the axis of evil in World War II. Italy was a core part of that. However effective or ineffective they were a part of it. And Italy was going to be very, very involved, especially in regards to the attacks on Malta. Hoping to keep Italy out of the war, the British government strongly considered handing over Malta So we're
How disastrous that be?
Oh, could you imagine? I mean, this whole thing goes back, we've talked about appeasement and all of that. It all goes back to some of these dreadful policies that were considered. We're so thankful that didn't happen. But they were so keen to keep Italy out of it that they considered handing Malta over to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini as a bribe. And if you look at that, then you can pretty much kiss goodbye the campaign in Northern Africa. Roma would have probably been successful in that, probably would have done nothing to keep Italy out of the war. They had to pick a side or else risk being overrun.
It's interesting how the Italians decided to enter the war of the Axis powers as soon as France was defeated.
Yeah.
So as soon as France surrendered in May of 1940, the Italians said in June, yeah, we'll sign up, we'll join Hitler. We'd sooner be on his side than be on the British. Of course, Mussolini was a fascist as well, so ideologically, very, very similar to Hitler in terms of his ideology. Not so much maybe the Aryan race and not so much the whole concept of the final solution, but certainly a totalitarian state and fascist control was certainly the ideology of Mussolini's government.
Well, Mussolini pinned colours to the mast and Italy joined the Axis in June of 1940. They became, at that point, Malta had to stay. It had to stay in British hands, and it became a very crucial, vital part of the British effort to hold on to the Suez Canal and the Middle East. Mussolini's Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, launched its first assaults on the Maltese Islands on June 11th. So one day after officially joining the Axis, Italy's straight in on Malta. The harbour of Valletta received special attention, but unfortunately for the Maltese people and the small British garrison, nothing seemed available to counter constant Italian air attacks. What planes were available had been relegated to the defence of Great Britain or to Egypt. So that's how Malta came to be in the crosshairs, as it were, of Italy in the Second World War.
Absolutely. So talking about why Malta was so strategically important both to the Allies, certainly to Britain, but also to the Axis powers as well. So as the sole British harbour between Gibraltar at the west end of the Mediterranean and Alexandria in the east, the island's geographical position was crucially strategic and significantly for both the Allies and the Axis forces. The British and Commonwealth aircraft based in Malta could reach Italy and North Africa in their attempts to hinder the supply lines of Rommel's campaign. Therefore, the island became the focus of attention of Germany and the Italian air attacks in their attempts to neutralise the military bases and to bomb the islanders into submission. Malta's 250,000 people suffered long periods of continuous bombing. They also underwent tremendous hardship as little in the way of food or medicines were managed to penetrate the blockade, preventing merchant ships from entering the port. The convoys bound for Malta suffered extremely heavy losses of ships and their crews, and between February and June of 1942, only 2 out of 24 ships successfully unloaded their cargoes. The islanders were forced to spend much of their time in caves and tunnels to shelter from the insistent and long-lasting air attacks. In response to daily air raids and the frightening dive bombing tactics of the enemy, the Maltese civilians had begun to dig underground shelters through the limestone rock from early 1941. This was partly an attempt to hasten what became an efficient government policy. The implementation, though, was hampered by a shortage of skilled miners and appropriate equipment. And this really leads us on to the star of the show, and that is Sir Lieutenant General William Dobbie. Do you want to explain who he is?
I will do. I just want to read a couple of the emails. We are live and interactive this evening, guys. Thank you for those who've written in already. Norma, my apologies. I was kicking myself as soon as I said it. You are quite correct. It is the George Cross, not the St. George Cross, although I do hope that King George VI was a saint in Christ. it is not the St. George Cross. It is in reference to King George VI. Also, Graham, he says, quite rightly, our God loves the underdogs. Malta is a great example to us of this. And George Cross is a small reward. Remember the African proverb, if you think you are too small to make a difference, remember mosquitoes. We can make a difference. Shalom, keep up the inspiration. And then there's, I'm not really certain, Jay, what this has to do with the program. You're saying Malta has deep foundations in Freemasonry, but that's not our topic this evening. So,
no, it's not.
Indeed, we could say that very much about this country and many countries.
Probably a link to the Knights Templar, but
yeah, definitely.
But moving on, and really show how the scene. So if we paint the picture, Malta is in a desperate situation. The British are desperate to keep Malta, despite the incredible attacks that are taking place on Malta, either firstly from the Italian Air Force, then followed by the Luftwaffe. And the main goal of the Germans and the Italians, the Axis power, is to take Malta, so to actually protect the German supply lines to Libya to help General Rommel with his African campaign to take the whole of North Africa and the Middle East. And also strategically important for the British war efforts were the oil wells in the Middle East, which was needed to actually fuel Britain's military machine against the Nazis.
Lieutenant General Sir William Dobby, an incredible individual by all accounts. It's so important that we understand the leadership of a nation such as Malta at its greatest time of crisis. Generally, the people in their response will reflect their leader and his response. And that's definitely the case with Lieutenant General Sir William Dobby, a man of deep religious faith. Apparently had been since his school days. He once said that when he was a boy in his teens, I heard it said that Christ came to earth to reveal the ways of God to man, but I had never taken it in. I got to thinking it might be a sensible thing to take the troubles to turn to the Bible, turn to the Bible and see for myself. I've read the Bible every day since then, always if possible before the day's work, and often before having to make decisions. And Dobby, who is a member of the Plymouth Brethren and the author of numerous pamphlets on religion for army use, finds that neither the progress of science nor war has disturbed his faith, nor does he believe that the military profession is necessarily an evil. This is what he wrote. This is very helpful, I think, for those who may be more of a pacifist slant. It will be seen that the scripture indicates that the profession of arms is an honorable and lawful one, that the use of force and material weapons is not incompatible with faith in God, that God is a God of order who has ordained that human government shall maintain order with force, that the time is not yet, although it will surely come, when the government will be on his shoulder and man will be able to beat his sword into a plowshare. Now, when the Second World War burst upon Europe in the fall of 1939, Dobby, though in retirement after his own long and illustrious military career, offered his services to his government, and the following April was sent to command the strategic Mediterranean Island of Malta. Remember, he was a Scot, he was not a native Maltese man. It was situated 900 miles in either direction from the nearest friendly base, Gibraltar to the west and Alexandria to the east. It was once believed by some London officials to be a military liability. Why would that have been?
Primarily because Malta, the population is largely Catholic.
Right.
And he was a very, very strong, ardent Protestant, and he wore his faith on his sleeves. Everyone knew that he was a believer. Everyone knew that he was incredibly strong. I mean, you're going to find out later a fantastic quote that Winston Churchill describes him of having a sword in the one hand and a Bible in the other. And Winston Churchill quoted that in the House of Commons regarding Lieutenant General William Dobby. So he was also made a huge impact during the First World War and served under General Haig as well. So his military credentials were quite incredible. But the fact is that God put this Bible-believing Christian to to be the governor and then commander-in-chief of Malta, knowing its strategic importance, I think only God can do that.
Absolutely. Though once considered a military liability, Malta is now credited with contributing largely to the downfall of the Axis power in the Mediterranean theatre and elsewhere. Under General Dobby's guidance, Malta became a constant threat to the Axis supply line, prevented thousands of Axis planes from reaching Europe. Indeed, they were so focused, some of them, on bombing the daylights out of Malta that definitely detracted and distracted from elsewhere. They also, in engaging in action in the Battle of Britain and on the Russian front, it kept Axis aircraft from engaging there and provided a base for British submarines preying on Axis shipping. General Dobby was equal to the situation and together firmly believed that it was God's help which brought through the crisis. And typical of the spirit was one of Dobby's orders of the day. It may be that hard times lie ahead of us, but however hard they may be, I know that the courage and determination of all ranks will not falter, and that with God's help, we will maintain the security of this fortress. I call on all officers and other ranks humbly to seek God's help and thus in reliance on Him to do their duty unflinchingly. I really wish we would have some leaders that would say words like that.
Absolutely, and I love this as well. It says Dobby is described as steadfastly calm and unflinching in the face of danger. During the worst of the air raids, he could be found helping the wardens to rescue the wounded and the helpless. At one time, he rescued a Persian cat, Maurice, which became his constant companion. A young British officer, proud of his commander's courage, said, Dobby paid no more attention to bombs and machine gun fire than to rain. He was in the tower of the palace roof when the Germans, trying to get the crippled Illustrious at the dockyard, that is the ship Illustrious, concentrated more firepower on Valletta and Grand Harbour than has ever been released on any other spot on Earth. And earlier yesterday, I recorded a fantastic interview with Lieutenant General Dobby's grandfather. Let's take a look. We have a very special guest joining us on Behind the Headlines. He is Brigadier Ian Dobby, OBE, from the Royal Engineers. Ian, it's an absolute pleasure that you can join us on Behind Headlines, particularly knowing the incredible spiritual legacy that your grandfather left behind. But can you share with us your distinguished military career? I mean, you reached the rank of Brigadier in the Royal Engineers. Share with us your military experience.
Well, it was nothing like as distinguished as my grandfather's, but I was commissioned in 1958 into the Royal Engineers, and 15 years of my service altogether took place in Germany, in the old British Army of the Rhine. I think I commanded Royal Engineers soldiers in every rank between second lieutenant and brigadier over those years. I also had a 2-year tour in the Union of Arab Emirates just after the Union had been formed. And I had 2 tours in Northern Ireland in the infantry role, and which I wouldn't have missed for anything because one saw the British soldier at his very best out there. And the rest of my tour, my service was in the United Kingdom, included tours as an instructor at the RAF Staff College and at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst as well.
Fabulous. And I also have Rex Parkinson to thank for setting this interview, so I'm very grateful to him. But can you share with us the incredible story of your grandfather, Lieutenant General Sir William Dobby, who became governor of Malta during the Second World War? And you describe him as a Christian colossus. Without his Christian faith, maybe the island of Malta would have actually been invaded by the Germans, and we could have seen a completely different outcome of the Second World War.
Well, it was a very significant appointment, and my grandfather regarded the survival of Malta as a real answer to prayer. I mean, there is this little island, smaller than the Isle of Wight, which took 2,300 air raids in the course of his 2 years as governor, and at a time from which the Italians had come into the war, which was the month after my grandfather arrived in May 1940. Really, there was no friendly territory within 1,000 miles of Malta at that time. And of course, it had this wonderful harbor at the capital, Valletta. So it was very significant from that point of view. And also, of course, it was from that harbor that submarines could deploy and take out so much of the logistic shipping, which was being used to support Rommel's Africa Corps in North Africa. And so its significance from a strategic point of view was enormous. And Churchill realized this, and he was wonderfully supportive to my grandfather. My grandfather believed that, as I say, the survival of Malta was really due to answered prayer. And in a wonderful way, my grandfather was given grace, really, to relate wonderfully well to the people of Malta, who are deeply religious. They're of a different hue to himself. And they respected him as a man of God, and that was fundamental to his holding the confidence of the general people of Malta.
You talked a little bit there about Malta's strategic importance, and also being 1,000 miles away from any Allied territory, as we know that Italy joined the war in the summer of 1940, and of course Rommel led the German North Africa campaign. Now, can you share with us what would have happened had Hitler been able to conquer and invade Malta, and how this would have actually threatened not only the entire North Africa, but also the Middle East as well, and the oil reserves that were vital to the Allies' war efforts against the Germans?
Well, I think it's self-evident that without Malta, we wouldn't have had the means of being able to cut off the logistic support to Rommel's Africa Corps. That was really fundamental. And the fact that he was not able to have the mobility that he really desired in his military operations, it substantially improved the circumstances for Montgomery and the other military commanders that we had with their backs to Egypt and so on. All support for them would have to have gone right down the Atlantic and round the southern Cape of South Africa and up through the Suez Canal. And of course, the time that would have taken would have been enormous. So both in providing advantage for ourselves and disadvantage for the Axis powers, the significance of Malta was enormous.
And share how your father was able to rally the people of Malta behind him, considering that that Malta faced almost 3 times the intensification of bombing than Britain did during the Blitz. And to actually survive that bombardment was absolutely incredible. That the island itself received the George Cross, and that's what we're celebrating in this program, the 80th anniversary of Malta receiving the George Cross for bravery and gallantry.
Well, my grandfather was an absolutely open Christian, and he used to use broadcasts to the people of Malta regularly, and at all times he encouraged them to trust in God, a God who answered prayer. And it was his own personal faith was well known, and indeed guests who came to a meal at his palace at St. Anton, he would pray with them before they left. And this sort of an absolute open Christianity. And he had a very clear testimony of how he had come to faith himself as a boy of only 14, at Charterhouse, the same school as John Wesley, incidentally. And that had sustained him through military operations, through his service. And he knew that God would stand by him again in this big responsibility that he'd given him in Malta as well. The Maltese were deeply religious. They were referred to as being more British than the king and more Catholic than the Pope. And although doctrinally he would be very different from them, they nevertheless greatly valued that they had a God-fearing man who was leading them at that time. It was fundamental to his holding their confidence.
And Ian, can you share with us what the great man himself, Sir Winston Churchill, said about your grandfather?
Well, the best known remark that Churchill made about him, and I think this was in the House of Commons, he referred to him as that remarkable man, General Dobbie, a Cromwellian figure at a key point, fighting with his Bible in one hand and his sword in the other. And that statement was quite well known because when I had to go and see my headmaster just before I was about to leave school, he said to me, "You've got a lot to live up to, haven't you?" And he actually quoted that statement of Churchill's about my grandfather. And that was 14 years later. So it was quite a well-known attribution.
But can you share with us really through the power of prayer, believing that your grandfather was a colossus in the faith, prayer would have been such an important part of his life. And here we see that the Lord really put him in a position of incredible authority to actually be the governor of the British colony that was Malta. And this small island would play such a strategic role in the Second World War, and without him being there, this could have altered the whole outcome of the Second World War, could it not?
Well, I wouldn't wish to overstate that because I think his successor, General Lord Gort, did a wonderful job as well, though the greater part of the siege, of course, was during my grandfather's time. And I mean, one of the most dramatic answers to prayer that my grandfather had was when the Illustrious, an aircraft carrier, came into Malta, having been hammered by the Axis powers air forces with its flight deck inoperable. It was dragged into Valletta Harbour, and my grandfather went down to see the engineers and asked them for a prognosis and assessment. And they said that provided nothing hit the Illustrious for 3 days and 3 nights, they would work 24/7. And they thought they would then have it ready to go on to Alexandria. And my grandfather, and I've heard him say this in a talk he gave to young people, went back to his palace and just knelt down and put the whole matter in God's hands. And over the next 3 days, with the Royal Air Force doing magnificent deterrent work, there were bombs landing in the harbour, in the water, in the buildings around the harbour and so on, but very little hit the Illustrious. And after 3 days and 3 nights, under the cover of darkness, she slipped out of Valletta and went on to Alexandria in the east, and at an average of 25 knots. And the signal which Churchill sent my grandfather, and I've got a copy of it here, I think, was really wonderfully grateful. And that was, I think, one of the most dramatic answers to prayer that my grandfather had. And he was convinced that Malta would stand. And when Churchill got him out just in time, because his health was failing, he was asked to broadcast on what I suppose was the Home Service in those days. And he believed that in answer to prayer, Malta would stand. And of course, it did.
Well, which is absolutely incredible. But can you also share with us the kind of desperate situation that the people of Malta were in during those years between 1940 and really 1942, under this siege, with a lack of food coming through, that almost daily bombardment by first Italian Air Force and then the Luftwaffe, and then combined with the fact of the brave and courageous RAF fighter pilots that would defend the island?
Well, there were 2,300 air raids during those 2 years of my grandfather's governorship. And the difficulty with a convoy that convoys had in getting through to Malta was substantial. And the very worst moment, I think, was when the island was within probably 14 days of starvation. And my grandfather had to take very, very severe measures over rationing and that sort of thing. The other thing he did was to, Malta is an island built of limestone rock, and I'm not a geologist, but I gather that it's quite a soft rock to work, but the exterior hardens very quickly when exposed to fresh air. And he aimed to put 25 foot of limestone rock for Maltese sheltering in caves and shelters and any bomb that exploded. And the fact that overall during the course of the siege, only I think it was 1 in 200 were actually killed. Is really an amazing testimony as to how effective that was. That unquestionably the work that was done to provide protection for the Maltese like that really paid off.
Fabulous. And finally, Ian, what are your thoughts as we remember the 80th anniversary of the Island of Malta being awarded the George Cross for bravery and gallantry, and no other country has received that honour. And a lot of this is thanks to the incredible work, courage and bravery of your grandfather.
Well, it was a wonderful honour that came within a few weeks of my grandfather being relieved by Churchill, and it was an enormous encouragement. It was the first of only 2 times that the George Cross has ever been awarded collectively. The second time was by Her Majesty the Queen to the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Those are the only 2 times it's been awarded colloquially. And I think it was wonderfully well deserved. In fact, I've got a copy of the letter that King George VI wrote to my grandfather here, and it's a very short letter, and I'll just quote it. "To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta, to bear witness to a heroism and a devotion that shall long be famous in history." And my grandfather had great pleasure in replying to thank the King for this signal honour.
Brigadier Ian Dobby, OBE, I just want to thank you so much for being our special guest and telling us about your remarkable grandfather, and just shows the lesson really that it's the power of prayer that we can overcome any evil. And this certainly was the case as we saw that Malta was not invaded by the Nazis, as we celebrate her 80th anniversary of receiving the George Cross. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
A fantastic interview there. Thank you for that, Simon. And it's so encouraging to be able to hear firsthand accounts and details of how God has used his people in a range of ways. And we've had some interaction as that interview has been playing on. Ian says, "Simon and Regan, not sure how you find these interesting people, but thank you for doing so and all your hard work." So definitely thank you for that interview, Simon.
We've got the Lord to thank, and also Rhett Parkinson from the Armed Forces Christian Union to thank as well. He was fabulous to interview. Brigadier Ian Dobby, amazing guy, so humble and so full of awe regarding his grandfather. That was very special. So I hope to bring him to the studios and do a full hour program with him to discuss his military background, his life, but also that of his grandfather. His father died, unfortunately, in the Italy campaign, fighting against the Italians. So he didn't really know his father that well.
Wow, it's incredible, and I'll look forward to hearing of that special edition of when he's able to be in the studio. That sounds good. Good evening, Simon and Regan. Thank you for your subject tonight. My husband was in the British forces. We were posted to Malta in December of 1962. I have so many lovely memories, and our twin daughters were born there. At that time, Malta was a very strict Catholic country. We left there just as the first tourist hotels were being built. God bless you both for all your dedication to bringing us so many interesting and informative subjects. Thank you for that kind word of encouragement there, Sally.
Yeah, so going back, let's just imagine what it would be like to have been in Malta during 1940, 1941, 1942. So in 1941 and 1942, there were 3,000 air raids, making the island of Malta the most bombed place on earth. The George Cross Island Association reports that from the 1st of January to the 24th of July 1942, there was only one period of 24 hours without bombs falling. And during this period, the island endured 154 continuous daytime and nighttime bombings. The demands for shelter was therefore great, and they were frequently overcrowded. And in May 1942 alone, 620 tons of bombs fell on Malta in one single month.
Hitler and Mussolini in Vienna had planned the invasion of Malta, codenamed Operation Hercules, for the 29th through the 30th of April 1942. The invasion would be by air and sea, and 500 Junker transport aircraft carry paratroopers with 300 gliders. One of those was featured in that role of that old footage a bit ago. And 24 Messerschmitt Bf-110s, junk gliders that would carry 200 paratroopers each, totally 29,000 soldiers by air. By sea, there would be 70,000 Italian troops that would land on the southeast of Malta and secure an airstrip to carry more troops and supplies. By July of 1942, the head of the Luftwaffe, Göring, opposed the operation, fearing it would be a repeat of the Crete disaster, and Rommel was against it as well, as he was succeeding in winning the battle for Tobruk on the 10th of May 1942, and he desired to take the British-controlled Alexandria in Egypt and the Suez Canal. Eventually, lack of trust in Italian fighting capabilities by the Germans also played a key role in the shelving of the proposed invasion of Malta. And I think we can see God's hand in that, in the resilience of the Maltese in holding up for so long, but in the shelving of that planned operation. There's this great quote in your book by James Holland, Fortress Malta, an Island Under Siege, Simon, that you highlighted here. It's on page 33 of the book. He said, "Not only are we confident in the righteousness of our cause, but that we have ample resources, both of men and material, in quantity and in quality, to ensure that with God's help, victory will most certainly be achieved." Now, as we've already seen, they were scant on resources, and he would have realized that. Darby would have understood that. At the same time, if you notice what he says, he wasn't putting his hope only in the resources. He realized they had strength, they had resources, but it would be with God's hand that they would succeed. And we're crying out for leadership that recognizes the need for God's sovereign care and guidance in these times. We
talk about the physical battle of Malta being absolutely intense, but the spiritual battle over Malta would have even been more intense. And the fact that we had Lieutenant General William Dobbie as the governor and commander-in-chief over the island of Malta changed its entire destiny. Because he was a praying man, he loved the Lord. He would, as his grandson was sharing there, Ian was sharing, he would actually then share his faith and would pray for everyone that would have a meeting with him. But he would also then go down and help the wardens, look after the injured and look after the wounded. He didn't care about being hit by a bullet or anything else. And so we're seeing he's an extraordinary man that God raised up for such an important time regarding the destiny, not only of Malta, but that of the entire North African campaign, and also that of the plight of the Jewish people in the British Mandate of Palestine that had Rommel's forces swept through North Africa into Egypt. They were ready to send out the SS to capture the Jewish people in those North African countries, but also ultimately destroy the British Mandate of Palestine, and then of course then have all the oil reserves in the Middle East. So this one tiny little island had huge significance and bearance during the Second World War.
Here's some details regarding its fortification. By 1942, Malta had 15 infantry battalions, 11 from the Commonwealth, 26,000 men from the Royal Tank Regiment, 130 coastal guns, and 112 of those were heavy guns. 144 light anti-aircraft weapons, which would have been a massive help in deterring an even longer period of shelling and bombing against that island. Operating from the airfield at Lucan, Malta, the air crews of 69 Squadron engaged in reconnaissance missions. The RAF station there functioned as the Mediterranean Command headquarters of the Royal Air Force during the war. During the siege, it would become crucial in the fight for the naval control of the Mediterranean and for ground control in North Africa. 369 fighters were engaged during the siege from the Fleet Air Arm alone. And at its peak, Malta's own RAF force, land-based, was 64 fighters, mostly the Hurricane type. They had 6 old 1930s Sea Gladiators, nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity.
There's only 3 of them could fly at a time.
Exactly. So, Faith, Hope, and Charity. And the greatest of these was Charity. On the 20th of April of 1942, 80 years ago today, U.S. aircraft carrier USS Wasp delivered 47 Spitfires to Malta, of which 30 were immediately destroyed by the Luftwaffe. Imagine that. Here's 47 Spitfires. Sorry, actually we have only 17. Now, in all of this, well, we heard a fascinating first-hand account there from the grandson of General William Dobbie, but there are other personal accounts that we have access to, other personal accounts that we have reading. There's one of these from a 20-year-old leading aircraftman, Ray Roberts. Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, so it was against this background towards the end of October 1942 that 20-year-old leading aircraft man Ray Roberts received notification that he was to be attached temporarily to 69 Squadron at Malta. For most of the previous year or so, Ray had been based in Shalufa, close to the Suez Canal in Egypt. They had been responsible for the maintenance and the repair of Wellington bombers of 38 Squadron. It was in Wellington that Ray was flown to his Malta posting by a crew from 458 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. Ray acting as a front gunner for the trip, with no time to settle into his new surroundings. Ray's first full day on the island was eventful. According to his diary, it ended with the plane he was in being shot at by a Messerschmitt 110, after which he and the rest of the crews were picked up by motorboat but landed safely. But even when not aboard one of the aircraft, Ray's safety was not assured. By the time he had arrived on the island, Malta had just experienced in October 152 attack alerts over 29 of its 31 days, and RAF ground crew at Lucan were not without their own dangers.
It's one of those scenarios that you can look at and say, this was an incredibly intense period of time for anyone experiencing this. But imagine being there on Malta, such a small island, and all of this is kicking off in the world around you. And you might initially be forgiven for thinking, oh, nothing severe is going to happen. But most bombed place on the face of the earth, as bad as things were in London, it was worse in regard to the shelling that was going on in Malta. There was hasty attempt to run repairs on seemingly endless succession of damaged planes, and they worked under the constant threat of aerial bombardment and strafing from enemy aircraft intent on destroying as many planes, airfields as possible. Some bombs, such as the Italian AR-4 or Thermos bomb, had been devised specifically to disrupt those working in places such as aerodromes, as they could detonate unexpectedly, being triggered by vibration. As well as persistent menace of enemy attack, the work also involved very long hours. And all this was carried out without an adequate diet and with the consequent deterioration in health. I was reading through some of these extracts from Ray Roberts' diary in November of 1942, and I was feeling, trying to put myself in his shoes a bit, that some of the stress of it. He goes through November of 1942, Wednesday the 4th, everyone is starving here. Thursday the 5th, we're being raided day and night. Gosh, are we hungry. Saturday 7, the Aussies that brought us were shot down into the sea last night. They are posted missing, presumed killed. The week commencing Sunday the 8th, there's a lot of work for us to do. I'll be glad when we get back. We are starving. Today I gave all my cigs away for a loaf of bread. Friday the 3rd, big raid today. Jerry attacked with ME-110s. He destroyed 7 Wellingtons and 2 Spitfires. Monday to Wednesday the 16th through the 18th, we get about 3 crashes a day and we have no equipment to repair them with. Sunday the 22nd, gosh, it really is terrible here. Work from dawn till dark and after and hardly anything to eat. Friday the 27th, how these RAF lads here have stuck this for 12 months is beyond me, but when you look in their faces, you can see that they're underfed and should all be sent home. Despite terrible conditions, the severe shortages of food and equipment, on the 12th of November, so about halfway between that diary there, the ground staff at Lucca were formally congratulated by the air officer commanding for achieving a record high level of serviceability, demonstrating excellent teamwork on the part of all concerned. The congratulations, I'm sure, were well received, but it's only God's providence. It sounds like that they were able to persist with such low energy and low provisions.
And the heat as well.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Being in the Mediterranean was extremely hot. I mean, I remember reading the book you got in front of you there, James Holland's book, Fortress Island, talking about the Spitfire crews and the fact that it was more relentless than the Battle of Britain to actually be posted to Malta to defend the skies of Malta, to intercept the forthcoming Luftwaffe bombers that were bombing the island. Was absolutely quite incredible. The exhaustion and the times that they would be called upon to go out. But Sir William Dobbie did, which was extraordinary, is that they changed the whole way of planning their military operations. So instead of going after the German aircraft that had already dropped their bombs, they would use radar, find out where they are and intercept them and learn the lessons from the Battle of Britain, and that did a major role. But no doubt there were lots of prayers and intercession during that time for Malta. And who would have thought that this tiny, small island the size of the Isle of Wight would change the entire destiny of the Second World War, as we see that God put his man in charge. And I suppose this is what we can really draw upon today, that we see a horrendous situation with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. But this story gives us hope that doesn't matter what circumstances that we're facing, what we're up against, what evil we're facing, we believe that we serve a powerful, mighty God who answers prayer and changes history.
Thank you all for your words of encouragement. Fantastic program this evening. Rachel points out that there is a full chapter on this in Pastor Peter Masters' book, Men of Destiny. I do have that book on my shelf, and I will be giving that article, chapter a read. Thank you for that. Great program tonight, Simon. Such an important subject to deal with, something I'm sure that is very new for many viewers, certainly for myself as well.
Thanks, Reagan. And I just want to thank you for watching this program tonight. You can now understand why the Island of Malta was awarded the George Cross for its bravery and courage to actually stand up against the defiance and to defy the Nazis, a bombing campaign against this little island. So I want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind Headlines.